Imagine this, a dark street. The silence of the night is broken by a single violent act that no one could have predicted. A young woman is the victim of a blatant abuse of power, and her abuser, a white police officer, is sure he'll get away with it. The only thing he doesn't know is that her boyfriend works for the CIA, and he is ready to go to the end to restore justice. Before we delve into this intense story, tell us your name and where you're watching us from. Your comments are incredibly important to us. You are our true heroes. Each and every one of you helps promote our channel, and we want to say thank you so much for your support. You are not just the audience, you are our inspiration and support in creating these stories. We truly appreciate each and every one of you, and your comments are invaluable to us. Enjoy the show. The night covered the city with a cold silence, but shadows lurked beneath it, ready to break out. The streets were empty, with only the occasional sound of footsteps or the muffled echo of a car horn breaking the silence. This evening seemed like hundreds of others, and maybe that was what made it the most frightening of all, for underneath the outward calm was something dangerous. A police patrol car rolled slowly down the main street, its headlights mercilessly illuminating the dark alleys, highlighting the smallest details: the face of a passerby, the silhouette of a young man outside a closed store, the traces of rain on the asphalt. Inside the patrol car, behind the wheels, Saturday, a man who is used to feeling himself the master of these streets. For him there were no shades of gray. He saw a threat in anyone who looked or dressed wrong. The patrol was routine, almost lazy, but the tension hanging over the city was physically palpable. The policeman's gazes, intense and assessing, slid over the passersby, pausing a little longer on those whose skin was darker. Their eyes gave away more than they would have liked a heavy, pervasive prejudice judgment, as if anyone born with the wrong skin color was already guilty. Driving past another block, the policeman in the car tensed as he saw the dark silhouette of a girl crossing the empty street. His gaze locked on her. Something dark, unkind flashed through his mind. This ordinary evening had taken on a new interest for him. Her name was Alicia, and she had dreamed of more her whole life. Alicia grew up in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, among many children who were raised with resilience and perseverance. She was the kind of person who believed strongly in changing her destiny, and she woke up every morning with a clear goal to make life better for herself, her family, and the community that empowered her. Alicia worked as a physician's assistant in a small clinic on the south side of town. She was one of the few nurses to whom patients lined up, knowing they would find her caring and sincere attention. Her plans for the future seemed almost simple: to graduate from medical school, to become a full-fledged doctor, despite all the obstacles, and to help her neighborhood, where people seemed to be alone with their diseases and troubles. She believed that with perseverance in education, one could break barriers and stereotypes, but her faith was tested more than once. She had already experienced racial bias, even in her attempts to follow her dreams. During her studies, Alicia had to hear phrases veiled as jokes from classmates or even professors that medicine was not her place. They spoke of restraining potential and advised her to be more realistic in her ambitions. But what was most painful was how she sometimes felt like an outsider, even within the walls of the clinic where she worked. Some patients who saw her at the counter preferred to turn away or demanded to be served by someone else. Those moments left scars, but she learned to hide the pain under a mask of resilience. On those days when the bias was most apparent, Alicia would look at herself in the mirror and remind herself that no one had the right to determine her future. She knew the path she chose would not be easy, but she was willing to fight for every opportunity. On this evening, however, her thoughts were far from thoughts of struggle and discrimination. She was enjoying the rare feeling of calm that comes when all the tasks of the day are completed and you return home. Alicia dreamed of the coming weekend, of meeting her boyfriend, who was not only a support but also a reminder that her efforts were not in vain. She believed that their future would be bright and fair, that they would overcome all obstacles together. But that night, walking down the quiet street, Alicia had no idea that the dark silhouette in the patrol car was already watching her. The hidden threat lurking in the stranger's gaze disturbed the fragile idol of her dreams and hopes. Alicia had almost reached the house when the headlights of a patrol car crossed her path, sharply illuminating the empty street ahead. The police car stopped at the curb, and a man in uniform got out. He headed toward her with a friendly smile. but there was something in his gaze that made Alicia tense. "Good evening," he said, almost affably, but his tone was dry, with a slight, faint shadow of command. "A little late for a walk, aren't you?" Alicia replied calmly, trying to keep her voice neutral. She knew it was best not to antagonize the officers in the slightest. Even in such simple situations, she felt the weight of bias, and this moment was no exception. "I'm just coming back from work," she said quietly, smiling as friendly as possible. The policeman, as if by accident, took a step closer to her, looking down at her appraisingly. Alicia caught his gaze sliding down her figure, lingering on her face with an expression that was a mixture of contempt and intense, humiliating interest. "What's your job, if it's no secret?" he asked. His voice no longer had the strained courtesy. She replied that she worked at the clinic, though fear was growing inside her. The officers grinned, as if it were something funny, as if the idea that a black girl could be a nurse seemed ridiculous to him. "Really," he said with a touch of sarcasm, "it's not often you find people like you in medicine." Or he paused, his smile gone, his gaze cold and hard. "Maybe you do something else there." Alicia felt her heart beat faster. She suddenly realized that there was no one here but the two of them. The street was empty, and the only light came from a dim streetlight around the corner. The officers were standing too close, and she sensed that he was already out of line. "I do work there," she answered firmly, trying not to give in to her fear, but that only made his displeasure erupt in his gaze. "You're all the same," he said abruptly, anger in his eyes. "Do you think that if you get a job at the clinic, you can pretend to be something you're not?" His words sounded rough and harsh, and Alicia felt the tension seize her from head to toe. Her throat constricted as if a noose had tightened around her neck. She suddenly felt all the weight and pain that had haunted her more than once because of the racial bias, the hidden and overt humiliation she'd been subjected to. But this was a different level of threat. "I have to go," she said quietly, deciding to leave before the situation got out of hand. But the officers blocked her way, reaching out and grabbing her shoulder as if by accident. His grip was strong, and there was nothing of the ostentatious friendliness with which he had begun the conversation. Something dark and cruel flashed in his eyes, as if he had gained the right to control her fate. For he was the law, and in this place, on this night, he was sure of his impunity. "You're not going to get away that easily," he whispered, pulling her closer and squeezing her shoulder with painful strength. Alicia felt her heart freeze and then pound in her chest when the policeman's gaze, cold and piercing, wouldn't let her go. She tried to twist out of his grip, but he held her tight, his face reflecting only indifference and a strange satisfaction. "Look, I didn't do anything," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice calm, even though panic was already overwhelming her inside. The policeman chuckled faintly and, leaning a little closer, said, "Maybe you didn't, but you know, someone like you can carry anything." His words sounded like an accusation veiled as suspicion. He looked her over from head to toe, as if studying a potential threat, and took a step back, finally letting her go, but her relief lasted only a second. "Empty the contents of your pockets and show me the bag," he ordered, holding out his hand as if expecting complete obedience. Alicia exhaled nervously, trying to find a foothold in her thoughts, but the street seemed deserted, cold and indifferent to what was happening now. She knew he had no reason to demand it, but she realized that resisting could make her situation even more dangerous. "I don't have to do this," she whispered, feeling her voice trembling. His eyes flashed with anger, and he stepped closer to her, forcing her against the cold wall behind her. Fear gripped her body, and his voice, icy, devoid of doubt, cut through the silence. "Didn't you hear me? I said empty your pockets, or should I do the search myself?" Alicia couldn't believe her ears. The policeman, the man whose job it was to protect her rights and keep her safe, was now using his power to intimidate her, stripping her of all dignity. She looked around, as if hoping someone would be nearby to stop this crazy moment, but the street was empty. Her hands shook as she slowly removed her phone and a bunch of keys from her pockets, feeling humiliated and helpless, but that didn't seem to satisfy him. His eyes slid over her back, and something unsettling lit up in them that made Alicia feel like a trapped animal. "Open the bag," he said, stepping toward her until there was no distance between them. Alicia could hear his heavy breathing, feel the threat that seemed to surround her like a dense net. But, there's nothing here," she whispered, but his rough talk cut off her words. He grabbed her bag, and with an abruptness bordering on brutality, turned its contents to the ground. Alicia watched as her personal belongings, medical supplies, and her purse were scattered on the pavement. She felt as if she had been humiliated in front of the city itself, as if all her dreams and hard work were now on the ground, trampled by the prejudiced gaze of a man who had decided she deserved neither respect nor protection. He scrutinized every detail with a grim look, as if hoping to find evidence of his accusations. When he found nothing to justify his actions in any way, his eyes flashed with disappointment mixed with anger. "Are you sure you don't have anything forbidden?" he said threateningly, leaning toward her so that their faces were on the same level. Alicia struggled to hold back tears, feeling completely vulnerable. Her body seemed panic-stricken, and the thought of no one coming to her aid was unbearably heavy. Alicia stood against the wall, confused and devastated, the coldness inside her, and every word, every glance of the officers seemed to cast a heavy shadow over her. He kept going through her things, going through them as if he were looking for an excuse, any excuse to accuse her. The policeman finally straightened up and, turning to her, hissed with displeasure in his voice, "I wonder, aren't you one of those people who thinks you can just walk the streets at night and certainly not attract attention? And you want to convince me that there's nothing suspicious going on here?" The officer's words sounded like an accusation, like a sentence, like a veiled threat. His words rang with prejudice, open and fierce. Alicia felt that in his eyes. Her skin color already served as proof of her guilt, as if her mere existence was a crime. "I'm just coming home from work," she replied, her voice low and raspy. She knew his words weren't about what she was doing, but who she was. The policeman snorted, shaking his head with an expression of contempt and arrogance that Alicia had met more than once in her life. "You have to realize that people like you are always under suspicion." His words were like poison dripping from his lips. "Do you realize I could arrest you right now? I'll find a reason, disorderly conduct, resisting the police. You name it, all I have to do is want to." There was a sense of power in his words, power he used to suppress and humiliate her, to make her feel that her rights and her dignity meant nothing. Alicia felt the weight of that threat. She knew he was right. He could have done this and no one would have come to help. His gaze grew even harder, and he took a step toward her, shortening the distance as if playing with her fear. "Did you never think the law could have power over you?" His voice was icy, without a trace of doubt or remorse. "You live in this city, enjoy its security, but you think the rules don't affect you." His every word resonated with her inner fear. Alicia felt trapped in the face of a man whose job it was to protect her rights, but who instead used his power to belittle and threaten her, simply for who she was. Alicia stood in a daze, feeling fear take hold of every nerve in her body. She could see that the situation was out of control. Her gaze searched desperately for some movement outside, some light in the window, but the night seemed to swallow up the world around her, leaving her alone in the face of the inexorable threat. The policeman stepped closer, his heavy breath ripping against her face, and his eyes read a frightening mixture of indifference and cruel satisfaction. He was a man of authority, accustomed to consider himself untouchable. It seemed to him that on this night and in this deserted street, he could do whatever he wanted. No one would see, no one would recognize. His cold gaze said, "You are nobody here, and your word means nothing against mine. Do you think anyone will protect you?" His voice sounded muffled, as if it took on a different, predatory meaning in the night. "But it's just us here, and you will do what I say?" Alicia felt her breath hitch, and she took a step back, but his hand grabbed her wrist quickly and roughly, giving her no chance to escape. The tightening grip kept her from moving, and she felt panic rise to her throat. She knew, her voice, her pleas didn't matter. She, a black girl, stood before a white policeman who saw in her only weakness, only something that would allow him to abuse his power. He began to pull her toward the abandoned alley, where the darkness was even denser, absorbing her strength and suppressing her desperate desire to resist. She tried to break free, but the cop's grip was steely, and her every impulse was echoed by the painful pressure on his wrist. He savored her helplessness, her fear, which she could no longer control. "You still won't tell anyone, even if you can get out of here," he hissed, grinning, and there was a frightening certainty in his words. Alicia knew he was right. The many times she'd seen those who tried to complain about police brutality and abuse of power simply not listened. Her words couldn't outweigh his status and power. No one would hear her truth. No one would believe that such a ruthless nightmare could lurk in this darkness. A cry of despair, full of pain and terror, escaped from her throat, but the night street remained deserted and deafening. She realized that at the moment, she was alone with the inexorable darkness that seemed to consume the world around her, leaving only her fear and terror of the one who held her fate in his hands. Alicia rose slowly from the cold asphalt, feeling the pain in every muscle and the shivering in her body that seemed endless. The night enveloped her in silence again, but in that silence there was only her own fear, which did not let her go for a moment. She realized that now, even if she screamed, no one would hear her and no one would come to help her. She looked around, as if trying to understand how this could have happened. She had always believed that despite her prejudices, she had her rights, that at least she was protected by the law. But in that moment, she realized how deeply mistaken she had been. To those with power and prejudice, she was just a black girl whose identity and whose life had no meaning. She was just another victim, no different from those whom stereotypes had long ago painted as suspicious, dangerous, unreliable. Alicia felt the bitterness of humiliation, as if it were a wound throbbing deep inside her. She fought not to cry, not to let the pain come out, knowing that this fear would stay with her, become a part of her. Her face, her body, her personality, all of it had become just another target for those who were used to seeing her only through the prism of prejudice. She realized that now she was afraid to even go home, afraid to meet the casual glances of passersby. Who would believe her? Who would want to listen to her story? Her gaze, full of pain, slid down the deserted street where something had just happened that had changed her completely. That night was a scar she would carry in her heart, a part of her that would always remind her that the world around her wasn't always the way she wanted it to be. Deep down, Alicia knew that she had many battles to fight for justice, for the right to respect, and for her future. But now, in this desolate silence, the only thing she felt was bitterness and endless fear of the injustice that had just become reality. Alicia stood shaking with fear and finally pulled her phone out of her pocket. Her hands were damp with sweat and her thoughts were jumbled in her head as she searched for the number of her boyfriend, Adam. In this moment, he was the only person who could support her, who knew the real her and understood what she was going through. As she dialed his number, she felt her heart pounding with each dial tone. She felt as if this whole night of horrors could tear her apart, and she needed his warmth, his understanding, to feel human again. Adam, she said when he finally answered. Her voice trembled and tears rolled down her cheeks. I need your help. His voice, full of alarm, answered promptly. What's wrong? Are you okay? Alicia could barely form words. Shock and fear made her struggle with each sentence, but there was real panic in her voice. She told him what had happened, how the policeman had abused his power, and how she was in a situation that seemed like a nightmare. I can't believe it, Adam exhaled, his voice becoming firm. Are you safe? Where are you now? Alicia, seized with terror, replied that she was in an empty street where no one could see her. I'll be there soon, Adam said, his tone becoming determined. I'm on my way to you. Just stay where you are and try not to panic. I'm not leaving you alone. As he spoke, Alicia felt her fear recede a little, knowing he was on his way. She felt hope begin to break through the darkness, enveloping her again. Adam was an experienced CIA agent, and his skills, his determination, all of it inspired confidence. I know you've been through a horror, but remember, this isn't over, he continued. I will make sure that this man is held accountable for his actions. She realized that Adam would do anything to help her. This assurance filled her with strength, and finally the tears she had been holding back came in rivers. Thank you, she said, feeling the warmth of his words penetrate her soul. I'm so scared. I'm here, Alicia, he said softly. I'm not leaving you. Being on constant alert, Adam knew how to act in a critical situation. He had worked in intelligence, and his experience gave him an understanding of how to deal with the authorities and protect people in distress. It's going to be okay, I promise. Just stay in touch and wait for me, he said, as she felt that this connection between them helped her regain her confidence. Alicia looked out at the empty street, her phone clutched in her hand, and hope rose in her heart. She knew that her story was just beginning, and that together with Adam, they would be able to confront all the prejudice, all the injustice that had oppressed her for so long. Adam came to his senses as soon as he hung up the phone. His heart was pounding with anger and worry for Alicia. He knew he didn't have time to hesitate. His experience in the CIA allowed him to act quickly and efficiently, and that was exactly what he was going to do. The first thing he did was open his laptop and connect to the secure network. Time was against him, but he knew he could get information on the police officers who had insulted Alicia. He started by searching the local police database, using the description she had given him in the conversation. Adam knew that the police had internal documents that could reveal not only this officer's name, but also his past. He had a history of racism and abuse of power becoming part of his job description. He was determined to find out exactly who was behind this horrible act. After a few minutes, he came across a name, Officer Jonathan Clark. His picture opened on the screen, and Adam couldn't hold back a wicked grin as he looked at the policeman's face. A rage flared up inside him. He began to delve into Clark's past and soon discovered a dark bottom full of racist episodes and abuse. It turned out that Clark had repeated complaints about his behavior. His file included instances of misuse of force, rudeness to citizens, and, most alarmingly, numerous accusations of racism. With each open document, Adam felt his anger rise. A man who was supposed to protect his citizens had become part of a system that itself supported discrimination. One report described how Clark used his uniform to intimidate young black men in his neighborhood. Such actions left no room for doubt. This officer was not just prejudiced. He was a true oppressor who used his status to sow fear and pain. Adam realized that Clark had been the cause of much of the suffering of the people whose lives he had crossed. And now that it had affected Alicia, he couldn't let this criminal get away with it. After gathering all the necessary documents and photos, he began to plan how to uncover these facts. His goal was clear. He needed to act quickly before Clark could cover his tracks or, worse, continue his abuses. He knew that fighting for justice could be dangerous, but he couldn't let fear stop him. "I'll find a way to bring him to justice," he whispered to himself, working his way through his thoughts on how to make it all happen. "Alicia isn't alone, and I won't let him get away with it." Adam realized that to do this, he would have to enlist the help of his circle, people who could support him in this endeavor. He knew he had resources, connections he could tap into, but most importantly, he had Alicia, and he was ready to fight for her. Jonathan Clark Saturday in his patrol car, waiting for his shift. Outwardly he looked calm, but inside he was seething with rage. His thoughts went back to the past, to what had shaped his beliefs, and how racism had become an integral part of his life. Clark grew up in a small town surrounded by prejudice and stereotypes. His parents, full of hatred for other races, hammered the idea of white supremacy into his head from an early age. Every week he heard his father laugh at the flaws of those who didn't look like them. He remembered his friends at school, discussing safety and order and linking them to skin color, and how he joined in those conversations, absorbing them like a sponge. When he joined the police force, he believed he had found his calling. It was an opportunity for him to affirm his beliefs in action, to bring his racist views to a system that supported his view that white people should protect their territory from threats. And he was ready to act. His first years on the police force only intensified his hatred. He witnessed numerous instances where his colleagues used force against black citizens, sometimes simply for walking down the street or looking different than expected. Instead of challenging these actions, Clark became increasingly immersed in a world of violence and aggression, justifying his actions with a desire to restore order. He began to act like a hunter, and in his eyes, black people became targets instead of people. These stereotypes gave him confidence. He felt that by subduing others, he was restoring order in his own world, a world that he believed was right. His reputation as a strict policeman grew, and he enjoyed causing fear in many. Clark considered himself untouchable. In his mind, he was the protector, and every time he used force, he justified it by saying that he was doing it for their own good. There was no room for doubt in his heart, and he did not notice how his aggression became uncontrollable. With each passing year, his hatred only grew stronger, and he became even more paranoid. There were constant thoughts that they always wanted to cheat him, steal from him, or even attack him. He turned into a person who saw only stereotypes and projections of his fears. His aggressive actions became his norm, and the white police officers who knew he could do anything became his ideal. Now that Clark had committed his worst crime, he didn't think about how his life might have turned out differently. He didn't see Alicia as a person, just another victim of his unconscious prejudices. His eyes were closed to reality, and he didn't realize that soon his own darkness would return to him, creating a storm that would tear everything around him apart. Adam immersed himself in studying the material on Jonathan Clark, realizing more and more with each passing hour how deep the problem he was facing went. He gathered all the available reports on past complaints, and what he saw simply shocked him. Every document he opened told the same story, a story of how Clark abused with impunity and his actions were never seriously scrutinized. Complaints from citizens popped up, describing the officer's aggressive behavior, inappropriate detentions, and even physical abuse. But instead of investigation and disciplinary action, Clark always received only warnings and superficial conversations about how to behave better. Adam came across one particularly depressing case in which the victim, a black woman, claimed that Clark had forcibly dragged her out of her car simply because she had looked at him wrong. His actions were clearly unreasonable, but in this case, as in hundreds of others, police cited a lack of evidence and closed the case. This report, among others, showed how the system ignored the voices of minorities, how their fears and suffering were simply cast into the shadows as if they meant nothing. Adam felt a growing sense of anger. The questions he asked himself tormented his soul. How is it possible that a man with such power continued to wreak havoc with impunity? How could a system meant to protect people allow such outrage to flourish? He realized that Clark was part of a larger problem, a system that protected its own and ignored cries for help from those who didn't have enough influence. In the course of his research, Adam also discovered that Clark had support among some high-ranking colleagues. These connections reinforced his sense of impunity. Not only did he avoid responsibility, but he reinforced his beliefs by gaining approval from people who also believed themselves to be above the law. This made him feel that he could do whatever he wanted without fear of repercussions. Realizing this fact only strengthened Adam's resolve to expose Clark. He knew he had to proceed carefully, gathering evidence and sincere testimony to reach the system that ignored these complaints. Adam realized that only by relying on facts and raising the voices of the victims would he be able to bring attention to the problem and make a difference. Pulling it all together, he realized that his job was not only to get justice for Alicia, but to bring attention to the system that had allowed this kind of thing to happen for so long. He had no right to give up. He knew that not only the fate of his beloved, but also the fate of many others who had fallen victim to such a system now depended on his actions. Adam spent long hours at his desk, the chaos of information and reports surrounding him slowly forming into a clear plan. He knew that in order to get justice for Alicia and stop Jonathan Clark, he needed to proceed thoughtfully and carefully. Revenge wasn't just an emotional reaction. It was a demand for justice that had to be met with a cool head and calculation. He began by gathering all available information on Clark, including his schedule, address, and even details of his personal life. As he studied the cop's daily routes, Adam noticed that he frequented certain bars and clubs where he liked to relax after his shift. This gave Adam an idea of how he could meet Clark in his own field. But before going any further, Adam realized he needed to build a support network. He contacted several trusted people in his department at the CIA who could help him in this endeavor. Not only was he looking for human rights experts, but also people who could gather facts, information, and witnesses. He also decided to contact a lawyer who specialized in police abuse cases to develop a strategy for future action. As Adam worked on the plan, he kept thinking about Alicia. He knew she needed time to recover from what had happened, but he also realized that there was no moment to lose. Every action he took, every thought he had, was focused on keeping her safe and getting her the justice she deserved. His plan consisted of several steps. The first thing Adam decided to do was to conduct his own investigation on how Clark interacted with those around him, how he behaved off-duty. Adam would gather witnesses who could confirm that Clark was not only violent, but aggressive. He knew that every word spoken against a police officers had to be treated with great caution. The next step was to gather evidence, video and photos of Clark's actions that could be used in court. Adam decided that the best way to gather such evidence was to set up hidden cameras in places Clark frequented. That should give him the material he needed to build a case against him. But eventually Adam realized that wasn't enough. He was also going to reach out to the local media. Getting the public's attention could be a powerful tool to spur the investigation and get the police to respond to the situation. He knew that justice often succumbed to public pressure, and he was willing to use that to his advantage. All this work required careful preparation, and Adam couldn't afford to get it wrong. He laid out a plan from every step of the way, thinking through the possible consequences and risks. His confidence grew as he saw his plan begin to take shape. He knew it would be risky, but he was willing to do anything for Alicia. As Adam finished his notes, he stared at a map of the city, noting the places where Clark might appear and the places where he was going to set up his cameras. At that moment, a new resolve flared up in him. This wasn't just revenge, this was an operation to get Alicia her life back, to prove that even the strongest abuses of power could be stopped. "I'll do it," he whispered, full of confidence in his actions. "I'll get justice." Adam began his operation, immersing himself in a world in which Clark felt like a master. With every minute spent in this new role, he realized how dangerous and unstable this venture was. He had carefully considered every detail, from his clothing to the places he would have to visit to gain access to the life of a police officer. His goal was clear: gather the evidence that would lead to Clark's downfall and his racist aggression. Adam's first step was to set up surveillance of the places where Clark usually spent his time. He knew that in his casual evenings, the officers could show his true nature, the insanity he hid behind his uniform. He'd spent several days visiting the bars and clubs Clark frequented. He had adapted to that world, adjusting to it as if he were one of them. Adam picked up on how Clark and his friends discussed topics that only emphasized their racist views. He heard Clark bragging about how right he was to deal with black people, laughing at his actions. Each such comment sent an inner shiver down Adam's spine. The hatred that poured from the cop's mouth was not just words. It was an expression of years of oppression and pain that had gone unpunished for so long. Adam began taking notes, recording every instance of bias, every racist comment, every threat. He knew that these testimonies would be important evidence to build a case against Clark, but he also realized that he had no margin for error. If Clark suspected that someone was following him, the consequences could be disastrous. Watching Clark, Adam noticed the way he interacted with his friends. It was full of arrogance and self-righteousness. Every word spoken to him was meant to demean and belittle him, emphasizing his conviction of superiority. Adam felt as if he was reliving all the humiliation Alicia had experienced, and it fueled his anger. He could not allow Clark to continue poisoning people's lives with his racist views with impunity. Gathering information, Adam planned his next strategy. He decided to use his skills to make contact with locals who might have witnessed Clark's actions. He knew that many of them had their own stories of how this police officers had oppressed people in their community. But alas, fear of the system kept many of them from seeking help. Adam realized that he needed to create an atmosphere of trust. He started talking to locals under the pretext that he was looking for information for an article about the local police. His charm and persistence allowed him to connect with several people who agreed to share their experiences. Each time he heard about how Clark had humiliated and intimidated people, his resolve strengthened. Several days had passed, and Adam had already collected a fair amount of evidence. His notebook was filled with names of people willing to stand up to Clark and descriptions of incidents he captured on a hidden camera, but he knew it was time to move on to the next stage, taking the situation to the extreme, bringing attention to Clark's actions, and finally making him answer for his atrocities. With each new piece of evidence, each new story he recorded, Adam could feel the tension building. He knew it would all lead to conflict, and perhaps even a dangerous situation, but he couldn't back down. He was willing to risk everything for justice, for Alicia, and for all those who had suffered at Clark's hands. With each step, he became more and more confident that he could expose this system of oppression and racism that had remained invisible for so long. This man will not get away with this. Adam was determined, knowing that his fight was just beginning. Adam stood in front of his computer screen, tensely reviewing the materials he had collected. Every record, every piece of evidence, every recorded scene, it was his main bargaining chip against the impunity of a police officers who had long felt untouchable. The evidence he had collected demanded attention, and it was time to bring it to light. He began by compiling a detailed account of Jonathan Clark's actions, describing every form of abuse and racism he displayed, from brutal detentions and humiliation to overt racist comments. It was all clearly recorded, corroborated by evidence, and captured on video. Adam knew that this kind of information didn't just need to be heard, it needed to explode the public consciousness, shattering illusions of police infallibility. Adam's first stop was at local human rights organizations. He met with several activists who were working on police violence and racism cases and gave them his input. He explained how Clark uses his power to suppress people, how he openly expresses hatred of minorities, and how his actions reflect systemic problems in the police force. This isn't just a case of individual abuse, Adam explained. It's part of a deep system of racism that permeates our society. We must make these voices heard. The activists were overwhelmed by the amount of information they had gathered. They had seen a system that should protect turn into an instrument of oppression, and Adam felt that their support would only strengthen his mission. The next step was to go to the media. Adam knew that fanning the flames in public opinion could have a critical impact on how the police responded to the allegations. He met with journalists who cared about covering racism and abuse of power. He presented his material to them, explaining how Clark had made people of color look like the enemy and how his actions had led to the suffering of the innocent. "We have to show the people the truth," Adam said, his voice full of determination. "They have to see how this policeman uses his uniform to justify his hatred. We have to make them realize that racism isn't just words. It has real consequences for people's lives." Journalists were enthusiastic about the information. They began working on articles that exposed Clark's actions and the systemic problems in the police force, including the racist bias that had become the norm. Soon something incredible began to happen. The public, previously silent and fearful, began to rise up. People began to share their stories, testifying to their own experiences of facing the same aggression from the police. The atmosphere in the city began to heat up. The bars where Clark used to laugh at his violence with impunity became the scene of protests. People took to the streets demanding justice and an end to racist violence. Not only were they expressing their anger, but they were uniting to create a powerful movement against bias and violence. Adam, seeing the community begin to change, felt his heart fill with hope. He realized that not only had he succeeded in exposing Clark, but he was part of something bigger, a movement for equality and justice. He knew there was still a long way to go, but already moved. He was determined not to stop. Every new report, every new article was important, and Adam was going to continue his fight to the very end. He was willing to do anything for the truth and for justice for Alicia and all those affected by racism and violence. At this point, Adam realized that this was not just his personal battle, but the battle of an entire community against systemic oppression. With each passing day, the wave of public outrage only grew stronger. The events triggered by the revelation of Jonathan Clark's actions captured the attention of local and national media. People who had previously been hesitant to speak out about their experiences now became active in protests against racism and police violence. The citizen uprising was not just a response to a specific incident. It was a collective response to decades of systemic oppression. Rallies erupted in the streets, where people waved placards with slogans such as "Justice for All" and "Stop Racism." A multitude of voices joined together in a powerful cry for help and justice. The protests brought together people from different nationalities and social backgrounds, uniting them in a common struggle against the racism that pervades all spheres of life. Adam stood on the curb watching what was happening. He felt pride and hope as he watched different communities come together to demand change. But at the same time, his heart was full of fear. He knew that not only could there be supporters of change lurking in the crowd, but also those who wanted to stop this movement. He remembered how Clark's cruelty had always found support among his colleagues, how hatred could spread like wildfire. The protests featured stories of people who have been subjected to racism in their daily lives. Black and Latino people shared their experiences of being stopped for no reason, of being treated with suspicion and disdain based on skin color alone. Women shared stories of how they were not given jobs or promotions just because of employer bias. Each of these stories emphasized how deeply embedded racism was in the fabric of society, from the police to the business community, and how it touched everyone's lives. Adam began to realize that he was part of something much bigger than just investigating a single case. He was part of a grassroots movement that sought to break down the stereotypes and biases that remained immutable truths for many. He noticed how his actions and those of journalists inspired people to take to the streets to say no to racism, violence, and impunity. Prominent activists and public figures soon joined the protests and openly voiced their support. This brought even more attention to Clark's case. The people he had oppressed began to speak out against the system that had allowed him to act for so long without consequence. The phrases "say it out loud" and "we will fight" filled the streets, coalescing into a united rally for change. Something amazing happened. The protests began to spread beyond the city limits. News of racist violence and oppression began to be discussed across the country. Adam knew this was only the beginning. Each day brought new stories and new faces ready to fight for justice. He felt that the country was moving toward an important moment where it would be possible to break free from the binds imposed by racism and the system that supported those biases. But in the midst of all this hope, fear remained. Adam knew that those who felt oppressed could be in danger. Clark and his supporters were not going to sit idly by. He could see the public beginning to wake up, also awakening hatred and aggression in those who had been on the sidelines of the struggle. From time to time, he noticed hooded men watching the protests with distaste, and he was overcome with worry. These faces spoke of the fact that racism was still alive, and it could break out at any moment. Adam knew he had to be prepared for it. He promised himself that he would do everything he could to protect the people who were coming out for justice, and that he would not stop until true justice was achieved. He realized that every story, every protest, every piece of evidence collected would bring them closer to their goal, and he was determined to fight to the end. When news of Jonathan Clark's actions began to become public, his fellow police officers realized the situation was spiraling out of control. Instead of admitting their mistakes and supporting the investigation, they sprang into action to save their reputations and cover for their comrade. It wasn't just a desire to protect Clark, it was a manifestation of a system that has always stood up for its own, regardless of the crime. There was a tense atmosphere at the meeting assembled by the department's leadership. Senior officers spoke of the need to maintain trust in the police and avoid negative consequences for the entire department. They did not want the public attention to go too far. It could jeopardize not only the careers of individual police officers, but also the entire structure based on policing. "We can't let this case ruin our reputation," the captain said, his face grim. "We have an opportunity to take attention away from this story. We have to do everything we can to prove that this is an isolated incident, not a systemic problem." At this time, Clark was in a state of panic. He realized that his actions were wrongful, and although he had always considered himself above the law, deep down fear gripped him. He knew that his colleagues also understood how serious the charges were, and he realized that their support would not last forever. He had to protect himself, and the only way was to use his connections. The captain suggested a tactic that involved creating an alternative agenda. They began spreading information about the police's successes in fighting crime, launching PR campaigns to divert attention away from Clark. A press conference was prepared at which the police were going to present statistics about the neighborhood's declining crime rate and emphasize their accomplishments in combating drug trafficking and violence. Meanwhile, under the cover of night, some of the police officers began to ferret out information about those who opposed Clark. They weren't going to sit idly by when the whole city was turned against them. Rumors that activists and witnesses gathered at the protests might face reprisals began to spread among the local community. Adam, realizing that this could happen, worked tirelessly to protect those who shared their stories. He contacted local human rights organizations and offered his help in organizing witness protection. He knew that those at risk needed to be supported, otherwise fear would suppress their voices and the movement for justice could lose its strength. Amidst all this, Clark, realizing that his temporary peace of mind was on the verge of breaking, decided to take desperate measures. He tried to connect with some influential people in politics, hoping for support that might help him get away with it. His connections with local politicians, who also had their own interests in maintaining a good image of the police, became his last chance. "We must act quickly," he told his associates. "If this story goes national, we can't stop it. We need to show that this is just a biased accusation, driven by activists and disgruntled citizens, and not the result of systemic racism. Clark and his colleagues began weaving their web of lies, claiming that the allegations against him were motivated by revenge and hatred. They planned to launch their own campaign, in which they intended to make Clark look like a victim of political games, and a campaign to discredit him. In their eyes, it was the only way to preserve their position and reputation. Meanwhile, Adam and his allies continued to gather evidence, exposing the truth about Clark and the system that supported him. They knew they couldn't let them deceive the public one more time. Every new record, every new piece of evidence was their line of defense. Adam realized that the whole fight came down to exposing the lies and restoring the truth. He felt that not only justice for Alicia was at stake, but also the future of the fight against racism and abuses of power. In this chaos, full of intimidation and manipulation, Adam knew one thing: fear could not be allowed to become a weapon used by the system. They must fight, and that fight was just beginning. The courtroom was full. Hundreds of people had gathered to witness a trial that could change everything, not just for Alicia and Adam, but for an entire society tempted by bias and systemic racism. Posters with slogans calling for justice hung on the walls, and tension intertwined with hope and fear lingered in the air. When Clark entered the hall, he was surrounded by his attorney and a few colleagues. Despite all the accusations and the hatred that plagued him, he still tried to look confident. His face, bearing the marks of stress and fear, gave away that he wasn't as invincible as he used to be. Sitting on the bench, he looked at Alicia and Adam, who sat in the audience, ready to present their evidence. Alicia, feeling anxiety wash over her, squeezed Adam's hand tighter. He looked up at her, his confident gaze conveying the support she'd been waiting for. She realized that today her voice would be heard, and her worries would become not just her own, but part of something bigger. As the case began, the prosecutor stood up and began to present the evidence Adam had gathered. He described the events of the terrible night when Alicia had confronted Clark, emphasizing how he had abused his power and disregarded the rights of an innocent man. Each new witness and each record presented in court created an image of Clark as an aggressor, whose hatred and bias defined his actions. As Alicia stepped up to the witness stand, she felt fear overwhelm her, but she knew she could not give up. Words began to come out of her mouth, describing not only the physical abuse, but also the emotional trauma she had experienced. She talked about how the world around her ceased to exist, how her life had changed overnight. "I thought the police were the ones who protected us," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "But I was a victim not only of violence, but also of bias based on my skin color. I couldn't believe this was happening to me, that I was being assaulted by the person who was supposed to be protecting me." The room was filled with silence, and many of the participants could not hold back tears. In that moment, her experiences became more than just her own personal suffering. They resonated with the story of many people who have faced similar experiences. Alicia did not just talk about her experience. She gave a voice to all those who have been neglected and suffered in silence. Adam, who had been watching her with pride and support, stood up to testify as well. He told of his search for the truth, how he had gathered information about Clark, how they had worked together to expose the system that allowed police officers to act with impunity. "This is not just about revenge," he said with conviction. "It's about bringing justice and showing that racism and violence should not remain in the shadows. We must fight for change so that no one else has to go through what Alicia went through." The trial exacerbated the issue of racism and bias in law enforcement. The prosecutor and defense counsel traded remarks, revealing more and more details about Clark's life and behavior on duty. New witnesses emerged, who recounted other instances in which Clark had abused his power, confirming that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader problem. The defense tried to discredit Alicia by making her look like an unreliable witness, based on stereotypes about how people of her color can lie for their own benefit. These accusations caused a storm of emotion in the audience. It was too painful to hear such words when everyone knew the truth. However, each time the defense tried to take attention away from the heart of the case, Alicia and Adam only became more determined. They knew that their words and actions mattered to everyone who had ever experienced discrimination and violence. Every moment, every response was the epitome of fighting for the truth. Eventually, the judge, after listening carefully to all the evidence, called a recess to review the evidence and testimony. People in the room looked around, and despite the tension, the sense of unity and determination to continue the fight became more palpable. Alicia and Adam knew that this was just the beginning, and they were ready to continue the battle to the end, not allowing hate and bias to gain the upper hand. Their voice became part of a larger struggle, and they were determined to seek justice for themselves and for all who suffer from racism and oppression. When the court returned from recess, the tension in the room was almost palpable. People frowned in anticipation, hearts sinking every time the door opened. Alicia and Adam sat side by side, their hands firmly intertwined, as if the bond was the only thing keeping them afloat in an ocean of emotion, fear, and hope. The judge, looking at Clark with restraint, began reading the verdict. This moment they had dreamed of for so long had become a reality. He spoke words that would long be remembered by everyone in the room. Based on the evidence and testimony presented, this court finds police officers Jonathan Clark guilty of the offenses of rape and abuse of authority. Loud sighs rang out in the hall. Alicia felt tears of joy fill her eyes. All those long months of fear and pain she'd endured didn't seem to have been in vain. She looked at Adam, and in his eyes she saw the same wave of emotion. Clark, the judge continued, you have used your power and the public trust for your own selfish purposes. No excuse can hide the terrible crime you have committed against this woman and against the very idea of law and order. Clark clenched his fists as if in a vice, but his confidence gradually dissipated. The courtroom was filled with the sound of quiet conversations and whispers, the voices of those who hoped for justice. Many people who had come to support Alicia could not contain rapturous emotions in the eyes of those who came to the trial. A spark of hope flared with every word spoken. In accordance with the gravity of the offense, the judge continued, I sentence you to 10 years imprisonment without parole. You are also required to undergo a course of rehabilitation and support related to your aggression and bias. Clark, listening to the verdict, realized that his world was crumbling. He, who had once felt at the pinnacle of power, was now humiliated. A terrible, ominous fear gripped him as he realized that his actions would be debated, his reputation would be devalued, and his family would face the consequences of his crime. He was forced to realize that this time the system he thought he was protecting had turned against him. When the judge struck the gavel, the hall filled with noise. It was a wave of emotion that came rushing out. Loud shouts of support erupted from the people who had come to the court, and Alicia and Adam, hugging each other, couldn't hold back tears of happiness. This was not only their victory, but the victory of everyone who had ever faced injustice. Clark was led out of the hall, his face pale and his eyes full of rage and helplessness. He couldn't believe that this was how his life would end, that his bias and aggression would lead to such terrible consequences. He thought of his co-workers who may have still tried to protect him, but they could no longer hide the truth. Society had seen his true face, and no attempt to justify himself could change what had happened. As the court closed its doors, rallies in support of justice began in the streets of the city. Groups of people led by activists shouted slogans for change and against racism. They were not going to stop until the system changed and the truth was restored. It was a signal for action, a powerful manifesto that the world will not tolerate impunity. Alicia and Adam, who felt part of this movement, knew that their battle had just begun. Every step they took, every voice that was heard was part of a larger struggle against oppression and racism. They were ready to continue the fight, leaving no chance to anyone who abused their power. It was a moment of reckoning, not only for Clark, but for a system that had long allowed such actions to go unpunished. Though they still faced many challenges, Alicia and Adam knew that justice was possible, and that fighting for the truth was a journey that would take together, inspiring others to take courageous action. In a world full of bias and injustice, after Clark's sentencing was announced, the public did not ignore the events. The protests and rallies that swept the city were not only an act of solidarity with Alicia, but also a powerful movement demanding significant reforms in policing. People took to the streets demanding transparency, accountability, and changes in law enforcement management. In the weeks following the trial, it became apparent that not only Clark, but the entire system that supported his actions was on the verge of change. The loud voices of citizens who were finally beginning to demand respect and justice were beginning to influence local authorities. The once silent masses of fear and doubt were now a unified entity, capable of bringing attention to the problems they faced in their daily lives. In response to public pressure, the mayor called an emergency meeting of the city council. On the agenda was a discussion of the need to reform the law enforcement system. Representatives of various communities, lawyers and activists were invited to the meeting to listen to their opinions and ideas. The mayor, realizing the importance of his decisions, promised that he would do everything possible to prevent such incidents in the future. "We cannot allow cases of violence and bias to go unpunished," he said, addressing the audience. "We need to review our working methods, provide better training, and improve interaction between the police and the community. We need to rebuild the trust that has been eroded." Sessions began to float ideas for creating an independent commission to investigate complaints against police officers, as well as implementing mandatory racial sensitivity and conflict de-escalation training for all officers. New protocols were introduced that would require police officers to record all interactions with citizens and openly share information about disciplinary actions. Activists such as Adam and Alicia participated in developing proposals for reform based on their experience and knowledge. They helped shape proposals to create special programs to support victims of violence and racial discrimination. Their voices became heard at a high level, and they realized that they now had the opportunity to change the system for the better. "We must ensure that no one is victimized by bias and violence," Alicia said at one of the meetings, "and that every complaint is investigated and those responsible are punished. We must create a system that serves everyone, not just a select few." Public pressure continued to build, and soon the authorities began to see changes. Hope for a better future loomed on the horizon. The police began to engage community representatives in order to create a dialogue and rebuild lost trust. Working groups were set up, including both police and activists, to discuss and solve problems faced by the city's residents. Nevertheless, the changes were not instantaneous, and there was still much work to be done. Some members of the police, accustomed to the old ways, resisted the reforms, but more and more people realized that fighting for justice was not just a slogan, but a necessary step toward change. Alicia and Adam continued to advocate for change. They participated in discussions and educational seminars, explaining the importance of respecting everyone regardless of their skin color. They organized meetings where residents could ask questions of police officers, and conversely, police officers could learn more about their citizens. With each new step they took, their hope grew, making sure that their voices were not only heard, but also taken into account. They began to see the system that had once isolated them begin to change. Society was becoming more cohesive, and people began to care more about each other and support their neighbors, regardless of race or background. As they worked to make changes, a spark of hope continued to burn in their hearts. Each step forward meant that they were not just changing their lives, but creating a better world for future generations. Alicia knew that this was not only her victory, but the victory of all those who have ever faced injustice. Although the road ahead was long and thorny, they were determined to continue their fight for truth and justice. Now that the system was beginning to change, they knew that their efforts had not been in vain. Together they were fighting for a world where everyone would be treated as equal, and where abuse of power would not go unpunished. A few months had passed since Clark's sentencing, and the world around Alicia and Adam had begun to change. The streets that had once been filled with fear and distrust were now filled with a spirit of unity and hope. The public protests that had been started as a result of their struggle had led to real change, and changes in the police force were beginning to bear fruit. Alicia, for the first time in a long time, felt she could breathe freely. She and Adam often walked the same streets where they had once felt fear and hopelessness. Now they saw how the new police, who were trained in racial sensitivity and respect for the rights of citizens, interacted with the residents. Police officers, who may have previously been hostile, now treated people with respect and understanding. "Look how things have changed," Adam said, stopping at a booth where police officers were handing out information leaflets about new initiatives and opportunities for community engagement. "It was our hard work, our efforts, Alicia nodded, her heart overflowing with pride and satisfaction. She remembered those terrible moments when her life had changed forever and realized how much this victory meant. Every step towards change in society was possible because of people who were not afraid to stand up and say, "Enough." As she gathered at one of the meetings, held to discuss the progress of the reforms, Alicia looked at the faces of those who had come to express their support and share their stories. She felt that the struggle she and Adam had started had inspired others to take action. Everyone realized that their voices mattered and that they could make a difference in the world around them. "We must keep talking," she said enthusiastically, "and protect those who cannot protect themselves. This is just the beginning. If we unite, no one will be able to ignore our rights." The people gathered reacted to her words with loud applause. Alicia felt that her story was not only a personal victory, but also a victory for everyone who has ever faced bias and injustice. She realized that everyone has the right to live a life without fear, that this is what is worth fighting for.
Despite all the changes, they faced new challenges. Alicia and Adam continued to work with activists to ensure that reforms were implemented and enshrined in law. Their work was an example of how civic engagement can change the course of events and make the world a better place. That evening, strolling through the park, Alicia and Adam sat on a bench and watched the sunset coloring the sky in bright shades of orange and purple. They felt that they were at least a little closer to their dream of a world where everyone would be equal, regardless of race or color. "We did it," Adam said as he hugged Alicia. "We changed life, not only for ourselves, but for so many others." Alicia smiled, her heart filling with hope. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We will keep fighting. Every action counts." And with these words, determined, they got up and walked on, each step bringing their ideal closer, a world where justice and hope would live in harmony. This story didn't end with Clark's sentencing. It had just begun. Now they had an opportunity to change the future, and they were going to make the most of it. For them, for all those who had suffered, and for future generations who deserve to live without fear or prejudice. Alicia and Adam knew that together they could create a world where everyone could live freely and with dignity. This story is not just a narrative of terrible injustice. It is a profound and powerful reminder of the importance of fighting for truth, justice and human dignity. Each of us can face bias, discrimination and violence, which is why it is so important to remember that we have the power to make a difference. The lessons of this story. Pierwszy, the power of unity. Alicia and Adam, who have become symbols of the fight for justice, show how unity and community support can make a difference. Every voice matters, and when people come together, they can make a significant difference. This story emphasizes that each of us can contribute to change, whether through activism, education, or simply by supporting each other. Drugi, it is important to speak out. The story emphasizes the importance of speaking out about one's experiences. By sharing her story, Alicia not only relieved herself of the burden of humiliation, but also inspired others to fight for their rights. Everyone has the right to talk about their feelings and experiences, and it is this open discussion that contributes to the development of society and the elimination of prejudice. Trzeci, the system must be accountable. The story of how Alicia and Adam worked on police reforms demonstrates that systems that support the abuse of power must be overhauled. This lesson reminds us that we have the right to hold those who govern us accountable. We must work to ensure that situations like this do not happen again, and that every case of bias or violence is investigated and addressed. Czwarty, hope for the best. Despite all the hardships the characters face, their story ends on an optimistic note. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, it is possible to find light and hope. It is important not to lose faith in the possibility of change, even when things seem hopeless. Piąty, activism and change. History emphasizes that activism is not just a word, but an entire movement that can change life. Each of us can be an activist, no matter where they are or what role they play in society. The important thing is to care, ask questions and strive for change. This story encourages us to think about the changes we can make in our own life and in society as a whole. It encourages us to take action, to become part of the solution rather than the problem. Your opinion is important. We would like to hear your opinion about this story. What feelings did it evoke in you? How do you feel about Alicia and Adam's struggle? Do you agree that activism can change society? What lessons did you learn for yourself from this narrative? Please leave your comments below. Your thoughts and ideas are important to us and to everyone watching this video. Let's work together to build a world where respect, justice and hope are an integral part of our life. Your comments will help promote our channel and inspire others to take action. We appreciate your participation and look forward to an active discussion. Dear viewers, we are very interested in your opinion about our story. Share in the comments what you think about the topics raised. Have you experienced racism or bias in your life? Your stories are important, and we value every word. Each and every one of you makes a huge difference to us and we are grateful for your support. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like to help us continue to make content that brings up important topics. We wish you a great day. Thank you for being with us.